Welcome to LimeLoop's Behind the Green Cast, where we get the inside scoop on all things sustainability and talk to people prioritizing and building a greener tomorrow. I'm your host, Rebecca Smith, and today I'm joined by Chantal Emmanuel, LimeLoop's own CTO and co-founder. Today we're digging into extended producer responsibility, or we refer to it as EPRs. Essentially, EPRs refers to adding up all of the environmental costs that you have associated to a product's life cycle. Right now, we're seeing some new legislation being built around this understanding and how it should be tracked, measured, and monitored. So what will this really mean for products and their packaging in 2023? Let's dive right in and find out. All right, welcome Chantal to our LimeLoop podcast, Behind the Green. If you could give everyone a little intro of yourself, that would be great.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. As you said, I'm Chantal Emmanuel. I'm the CTO and co-founder of LimeLoop. And at LimeLoop, we're really focused on making more efficient, economical, and environmentally friendly packaging that's better for all.
Awesome. Wonderful. All right, let's dive right in. We are talking today about extended producer responsibility, so EPR. Let's start it off by just giving an overview of what this is. What is EPR? What does it mean?
Yeah, so EPR is a funny thing because it's the underlying of probably a lot of the products that you're buying. But the thing that no one really knows about or talks about, really, especially not on the consumer side. So at its core, what EPR stands for is extended producer responsibility. And as the name suggests, it puts the responsibility and the onus of the end of life of a product back on that producer. And so what that looks like really depends on, where you are and what the product is, but it takes a lot of different forms. So for example, in the EU and Canada, it's been around for a while. So there's a number of different policies around, what packaging can be made of, what different products can and can't be made of, how recyclable it needs to be, how many times it needs to be reused. There's a lot of these rules about that. It's newer in the US. There are about 16 states right now that have different bills that are being brought about for EPR rules. There's 4 states that have one in place already, and that's Maine, Oregon, Colorado, and California. And there's actually 2 bills put before Congress to make that more of a national institution. So that's the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act, which was put forward in 2021. And then just last month in November, the Protecting Communities for Plastics Act.
Awesome. That's great. Yeah, it's always really interesting for us in the US, right, to take a look at what Europe, what the EU is doing, because they're always light years ahead of us when it comes to recycling and keeping the environment sustainable. So really interested to see that starting to move over to the US. Thanks for the overview. How exactly is EPR going to impact retailers this year?
Yeah, so again, it varies by what the policies are, but there's kind of some core components of every EPR policy that we've seen popping up to date. There's usually some kind of fee involved. So if you're making something and putting it out into the world, you're paying into this, they call them PROs, which are kind of these bodies of nonprofits that set the rules on how those materials to be disposed of and the education that goes around it. So there's some kind of fee involved. There's some kind of educational component. So there's requirements around the individual retailers having to put out and make public the rules of how to dispose of their products. And so you might see that come up as, if you've picked up a can of soup and you saw the remove this label, those kind of things come out of EPR policies that require that the brands be really thoughtful about making sure we as consumers know how to dispose of it. There are rules around the materials that can and can't be used, right? And so a lot of the different EPR policies you'll see will have a % of recyclable material that has to go into every product and its packaging. And it's this idea of not just having to, figure out at the end of life what to do with it, but that you're thinking further upstream when you're designing the product and thinking about the materials that go into it to kind of preempt what's going to happen at the end of its life. And so how that shows up for our retailers is that kind of 2 major things. Is one, they're really starting to have to understand and put numbers behind the environmental impact that their products have, both at the core of their product and then upstream the different materials and the packaging that goes into it. And what's today, a lot of retailers don't know what those numbers are. They have a general idea of, this is good or bad, but to say how much CO2 is going into production, how much CO2 is going into the end of life, those are numbers that people are not familiar with today that will become very important and not important, but a mandate of a lot of these EPRs. So that's number one. Number two is they're really going to have to rethink how they design their products, because you can no longer just say like, oh, we're just going to throw it away when it's done, or it's actually not even our problem. The consumers will throw it away when it's done. Like that kind of attitude is not going to fly anymore. And so when you're starting way
Right.
back from the sketchboard of, this is how we're going to design it to be able to pull apart so that you can recycle the paper versus the plastic. And this is what the plastic is going to be made of, or is there going to be plastic at all? You really have to go back to the drawing board and decide, how are you going to make these materials with that end of life in mind from the very, very beginning?
Yeah, that's really interesting because especially like as a consumer, right, we see the numbers on different recyclables and we see peel the paper off, right, and recycle that, but don't recycle the actual container that it's in. And it can get a little confusing, but not only is it confusing, it's not even like none of us are really even thinking about, okay, what kind of carbon emissions go into that? Or how are we protecting like our water and land use? Like those are just thoughts that consumers, I mean, I'm generalizing and making assumptions, right? But me as a consumer, it's not something that I sit there and think about before I go and recycle something. So this will be really interesting to see if we can really, like change that conversation around how we talk about recyclables and them in
Exactly.
the
Yeah, it takes
future.
away that idea of like what we call wish cycling, where just because something goes into a
Yeah.
recycling bin doesn't mean that it's actually getting recycled. And now the onus is to actually make sure that that does get recycled, and that onus is being put back on the retailer, not on the end consumer.
Yeah. That's where it'll be interesting to see how this kind of changes that conversation too for consumers in the future. Now that we have to think about this way more upstream, right, than just at the very end of that life cycle. So
Exactly.
that's exciting. But on that same vein, right? Different cities, different counties, states all have different rules and regulations around recycling, and they all have different challenges. And so, how is this really going to impact the future of recycling? Then, too, maybe more from that kind of end consumer perspective.
Yeah, so if done properly, it should really be a great partnership with recycling, because it is, again, making sure that things are being produced with recyclability in mind from the very beginning, and that a larger percent of recyclable materials actually make it into the recycling centers, right? So that's kind of the two issues that we're having with the recycling today. Things not actually being recyclable, and then of the things that are recyclable, only about 9% are actually ending up where they need to in the recycling centers to be recycled at the end of that. And so again, it's all about kind of that onus of whose responsibility it is to make sure that these things happen. And EPR, again, puts that back on those retailers. And so everything from, again, finding alternatives to the plastics that we're using today, especially, which are not recyclable, those don't fly anymore in a world where EPR rules are proliferating across the country and the world. And so what we're seeing already positively is that, retailers are then going back to the plastic companies and saying, like, we need bio-based plastics that will actually break down when put through just normal recycling facilities. It's no longer able to say like, hey, there's this one facility in this one state that can maybe break down this material. Like, no, we need materials that actually can be recycled in a really streamlined way. The same thing for compostability. People love to say that they have a compostable plastic, but you can't compost it in your backyard. You can't compost it in most facilities. Like EPR rules will put into place that say like, okay, let's make more backyard compostable products and make sure that those are actually available to end consumers, and that people know what to do with it at the end of life. And so again, so it's kind of twofold. One, it helps to prepare products to be made in a way that's more recyclable. And then two, it helps to instruct and educate the population on making sure they know how to interact with those products to make it the most compatible with their local recycling municipalities.
Yeah, interesting. Do you think that there's any kind of concern from some of these companies with these EPR regulations that, or with these programs, I guess, that are going to come out, that like maybe instead they started going down the recyclability path and this more sustainable path, that they might kind of pull back a little bit and say, okay, I don't know if we have this bandwidth in it to figure out what the right solution is. So now maybe we'll put our sustainability goals on this off to a couple of years as we figure this out. Do you think there's any concern around that from some of these retailers?
I mean, if I think there's a great opportunity for them to allow those two things to happen simultaneously, right? So if you're going to have to start reporting out your numbers, now's the time to make those numbers what you really said you were going to make them. And hopefully that's narrowing or getting closer to net neutral and zero CO2 emissions, and which works great from both the the, the marketing aspect of what a lot of these retailers are doing with kind of saying these numbers publicly, but actually in the back door, they're actually having to deliver on that because there's fees and different things that come into place if you don't adhere to the rules of your local EPR management. And so I think that if they're smart, then they'll see this as an opportunity to kind of kill two birds with one stone, right? To fulfill your EPR mandates while doing what's right for the planet at large.
Okay. Yeah, let's hope so, right?
Yeah, exactly. Fingers crossed.
Right, fingers crossed, always. Is this going to impact reuse programs at all also, right? Because there's a huge play here around reuse and how that can be a little more apparent and a little more of a focus for these companies. So what's that going to mean for any of these reuse programs out there?
Definitely. And again, age-old twofold. So in some areas, especially in Canada and France, part of the EPR rules include mandates around reuse. And so especially around packaging. So different retailers are having to design their packaging to be reusable up to a certain number of time minimum. And so there's an actual mandate built into a lot of these EPR rules. But even when it's not built into it, it just goes so perfectly hand in hand with the overall kind of ethos of EPR, which is essentially, how do we make sure that we're extracting as much value as possible out of something before we have to put it through its end of life process? And of course, when reuse is done properly, that's exactly the same thing that reuse is, right? How do we keep something in a cycle and in a circle in the circular economy as long as possible before it's, upscale to its next iteration in life? And so I think that, when done well, it should actually be the first thing that you look at as a retailer as a way to solve for your EPR. Like, where are opportunities within our supply chain that reuse makes sense? And let's start doing that now, because not only does it comply with the mandate of EPR, but we've seen time and time again that when done well, reuse is actually the greatest impact of reducing your CO2 emissions compared to any other program out there, whether it's recycling, compostability, anything like that. What reuse always nets out on top, if you keep it in the system of being a bigger impact reduction for CO2 and other raw materials.
Yeah, that's great. Do you have, just off the top of your head, like a couple of little bullets or like a list, I guess, of some places in the supply chain where like reuse is really effective, or a really easy way to like throw reuse into your or make some changes around reuse really in your supply chain?
For that, I always start by thinking and looking at, what aspects of the supply chain does something only serve a purpose for a very small percentage of time compared to the overall cycle. And of course, packaging is a huge part of that, right? So a package that you use to ship something out for its, 2 to 5 shipping day ends up living in the landfill indefinitely. Like, those kind of things just never make sense to me. And so anytime you have something like that where the life cycle and the value of it is so small relative to its overall lifespan on this earth, it's a great opportunity to jump in and put reuse into that space.
Yeah, that's great. That's a good way to think about it, right? It's such a small amount of time. So why would we put something that's such a small amount of time into a landfill for hundreds of years? That's basically never going to decompose.
Yeah. And then of course, the next area of that is when you think about like what's going on inside that packaging, clothes is the other thing. It's just kind of that, especially the way that we've designed fashion today to be, 1 year's fashion doesn't work the next, which has always boggled my mind, but it's definitely the way that we've set it up where, this summer collection is old school and doesn't work for next year. And so another opportunity again, why shouldn't those be designed in a way that, you either keep wearing it yourself or find someone else who can wear it and leverage it instead of ending up in a landfill?
Yeah. Every time we come back to this conversation, I always think about too, like I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, I probably had so many pairs of pants that were like flare on the bottom, right? Both leggings and jeans. And now I'm like, where did those go? And they're back in style and I don't have them. Like, why did I get rid of those? I should have put them in my cupboard, let them catch dust for a while and then pull them back out.
Definitely. I feel the same way.
Okay, cool. I have one more question for you. And this is kind of tying it back to the consumers, just because a lot of EPR rate really is all about the retailers. And so if more states start to move toward or move forward, right, with EPR and making these changes, how is that going to impact consumers, if at all? Like, is there anything that consumers need to be a little more cognizant and aware of?
Yeah, great question, of course, because anytime people hear fees on the retail side, the next thought is like those are going to somehow trickle down to consumers. And, again, EPR is relatively new here in the US, but we have had a couple of universities do studies on that exact thing, what that impact looks like for consumers. So one that's coming to mind to me right now is Columbia University did a study and they examined the economic impacts to consumers for EPR regulations on specifically packaged goods. And they kind of worked out this worst case scenario where because of the different changes, retailers are having to double the cost of their packaging. It's still about a 0.69% of the overall kind of grocery spending that we have. So in the very, very worst case scenario where packaging becomes really expensive because of EPR, it still accounts to about $4 a month extra to the average family on their grocery bill. Of course, especially with everything that's going on, we don't want to hear any additional costs, but I think we can all agree that, $4 for the benefits to our environment and to our planet is not too much to ask. And again, that's like a worst case scenario, which we're very unlikely to see. Whereas other studies have found no pass-throughs to consumers with the EPR program that have been in place to date.
That's awesome. That's good to know. I think it's helpful when you put like a dollar sign right around that. And then even if you think about $4 every month now, right? What is the cost if we don't do this later,
exactly.
right? To the environment. And that's all going to trickle back to us anyway.
Exactly. I always like to remind people that like, how much does it cost for these, ocean cleanup projects that we're doing? How much does it cost to be picking up, the plastic that's blowing around and litter that's blowing around in our major cities? And then, of course, our health. How much is it going to cost us all these microplastics that we're finding throughout our bodies, and what are the long-lasting effects to us? And then the healthcare costs that are associated with that over time. So I think if you really do have to do that true comparison of what that means to us today versus tomorrow to really understand what that $4 gets you.
Yeah, it's definitely a journey, right? It doesn't just end at this $4. It could be something way down the line too. So it's a good reminder to think about that.
Definitely.
Well, this was great. This was a great 101 on EPR, extended producer responsibility. So thank you for walking us through that. I will also in the show notes, I'll throw in a couple little links here also about EPR, just so that it has some of the legislation, some of the things that are going on. But if you could also just give a little plug for where people can find you online and where they can find LimeLoop.
Yeah, so you can find out more about LimeLoop at thelimeloop.com and reach out to me on LinkedIn, Chantal Emanuel. I think actually there's one other one, but if you see the one at LimeLoop, then you found the right one. I'd happy to answer any questions you have on EPR or anything.
Awesome. That all sounds great. Well, thank you so much for your time, and we will talk later.
Appreciate it. Talk to you soon.
Thanks for listening in to LimeLoop's Behind the Green podcast. If you want to listen to other episodes, visit anchor.fm/thelimeloop, and we'll see you in here next time.